Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the 2020 Virtual Gaithersburg Book Festival, or as we like to call it, the VGBF. I'm Phil Kaminsky, your VGBF host, and although we missed hosting you in person, we're so happy that you've chosen to spend your time with us virtually for this evening's watch party. Before we head into tonight's event, we would very much appreciate it if you would do two little things for us. First, please like this video. Second, leave a comment below to let us know where you're watching us from. Also, we encourage you to support tonight's author by purchasing his book through independent bookseller and our partner, Politics and Prose. And, very importantly, an extremely big thank you goes out to VGBF sponsors, the David and Mikel Blair Family Foundation, Downtown Crown RPAI, and Montgomery College. Okay, let's get started. Tonight, we have with us best-selling author and Washington Post columnist EJ Dionne to talk with us about his recent New York Times best-selling book, Code Red: How Progressives and Moderates Can Unite to Save Our Country. Dionne is a syndicated columnist for the Washington Post, a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, a university professor in the Foundations of Democracy and Culture at Georgetown University, and visiting professor at Harvard University. In addition, he regularly provides political analysis for MSNBC and NPR's All Things Considered. He is the author of 7 books. Interviewing EJ tonight is Eugene L. Meyer. Eugene is an award-winning veteran journalist with a passion for history, lifestyles, travel, real estate, and the Chesapeake Bay. He has been widely published in magazines, authored 3 books, including Five for Freedom, The African-American Soldiers in John Brown's Army, and was for many years a reporter and editor at the Washington Post. Since his departure from the Post in 2004, Meyer has garnered more than a dozen awards for his work. Welcome, EJ and Eugene.
It's great to be with you. Thank you, and happy birthday.
Thank you.
Second that. All right, well, EJ, it's good to see you even remotely.
Yes, and you too, Jane.
And let me start by saying thank you for writing this thoughtful book, and it's called Code Red. And so my first question to you is, what inspired you to write it, and why is it called Code Red?
Well, thank you. If I could just say at the outset, while I will miss the actual Gaithersburg Book Festival, which I love wandering around there, I love the people you run into there, I am really grateful that the organizers are honoring health measures for the sake of everybody in Montgomery County, but B, that they went to the trouble of making the book festival live online. So bless you all for that. And I also want to honor the great people at Politics and Prose bookstore. I love independent booksellers, and I have a special place in my heart for Politics and Prose, going back many, many years to the days when I used to go in there with for books and hot chocolate with our kids. So thanks to Politics and Prose. I wrote this book because out of both a sense of alarm and a sense of hope. The first sentence of the book is, "Will progressives and moderates feud while the country burns?" I argue in the book that at this moment in our history, people who think of themselves as progressive and people who think of themselves as moderate, and we can talk about those terms if we want, have a lot more in common than they sometimes want to think. And that's the case because of 2 factors. One is the Trump presidency itself, which poses, I believe, and I argue in the book, some fundamental threats to the country, threats to the way our democracy works, threats to our standing in the world, and threats to, I think, the long-term well-being of the country, but also because of a radicalization that has taken place in the Republican Party over a period of time that predates Donald Trump. And that this radicalization means that a lot of people who might once upon a time have thought of themselves as moderate or even liberal Republicans no longer have a place in their party. This book festival takes place in Montgomery County, which was the home of one of the great progressive Republican congresswomen, Connie Morella, people like Connie Morella just do not have any sway in the Republican Party anymore. And a lot of them have, in fact, moved toward becoming independents or Democrats. But the book is also offered out of a sense of hope, because I think, and we have seen this both during and since more or less the end of the end of the primaries, that on a series of issues, progressives and moderates actually want to move broadly in the same direction, even if they have some disagreements on the particulars of how to get there. They want to go to the same place, even if their GPS systems send them in slightly different ways. 3 examples I use in the book are climate change, where I think you have already seen in conversations between Joe Biden, Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, and others in the party, that progressives and moderates alike say this is an existential question for people, and that we need to move aggressively to do something about climate. In the area of healthcare, a problem that has been brought home to us so dramatically during the COVID crisis and the unemployment that has resulted, where millions of people lost health insurance because they were fired from their jobs. Whether progressives who are for single payer, whether you're a progressive who is for a single payer system, or a more center left or moderate person who says the way to universal coverage is through a public option, both sides want to get to a point where everyone has good, affordable health insurance. And then the last issue is what we need to do to help people either go to college, to afford college, or to have post-secondary training. There's a lot of agreement on ways to move forward. And lastly, I think the COVID crisis and the unequal suffering that we are seeing as a result, both the unequal suffering in terms of unemployment and economic trouble, and also the unequal health consequences, where African Americans and poorer people are much more likely to get the virus. I think inequality has become a mainstream issue that both moderates and progressives know we have to act on as a country. So my book lays out a way forward, a way moderates and progressives can work together, not only in this election, but also, I hope, in the years afterward, so we can make progress in each of these areas and in a lot of other areas as well.
EJ, remarkably, you anticipated many of my questions in your opening remarks, but I'll proceed anyway. Well, since the book was published in February 4th, it seems like so much has happened, with the acquittal of President Trump and followed by the primaries, a string of Biden wins. Bernie Sanders suspended his campaign and endorsed Joe Biden much earlier than he had Hillary Clinton in 2016. Elizabeth Warren endorsed Joe Biden. Even Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez endorsed Biden in April. And so my question is, has this coalition that you called for in your book already happened? How far along is it? You have unity task forces in the Biden campaign now, and many of Biden's positions have moved closer towards what you would describe, I guess, as a progressive wing. So has that already happened? Is that happening? Is that cause for optimism?
Right. I am very heartened by what has happened, because the argument of the book was indeed that these two sides should come to agreement on fundamentals, because they actually agreed on fundamentals going in. The first chapter of the book is about the 2018 midterm election, which I suggest is a model for what could happen in 2020. I think sometimes we don't fully appreciate how remarkable what happened in 2018 was. First point, that 2018 saw the highest turnout in midterm elections since 1914. Over 50% of Americans turned out for this midterm election. Secondly, there was a very strong mobilization on both sides, but the mobilization was even stronger on the progressive and Democratic side. If you compare the 2014 midterms with 2018, Republicans got 10 million more votes in 2018 than they did in 2014, but Democrats got 25 million more votes in House races than they did in 2014. Something big has happened in the country. I think one of those big things is that in all of those House races, moderates and progressives agreed to support each other. And so the class that came in 2018 included some well-known new progressives, people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Ayanna Pressley from Boston, who plays a major role in my book, but also many more moderate members, or moderate progressives, really, from different sorts of districts. I pay attention in the book to a number of them, particularly Abigail Spanberger out near where we are now in Virginia, outside of Richmond, people like Mikey Sherrill in New Jersey, Chrissy Houlihan in Pennsylvania, a lot of women in particular who were elected in moderate districts. And one of the striking things is that in 2018, both sides of this coalition understood that they needed to come together, that more progressive people in moderate districts not only turned out for, but went to work for more moderate candidates who could win in those areas. And obviously in progressive districts where progressives won some important primary victories, those candidates won by very large margins. It's very rare to, when you're a book author and do book events, to have a thesis of your book confirmed at a book event, but since Politics and Prose especially are our co-sponsors, I just bring up that when I did an event at Politics and Prose about this book, I told the story of how Abigail Spanberger out in Virginia got a lot of help, a lot of volunteer help from people who may have been more progressive than she was on her issues, on various issues, but were enthusiastically working very, very hard for her. And at the Politics and Prose event, someone stood up in the audience and said, I am that person. I am more progressive than Abigail Spanberger, and I worked very hard for her, and I'm glad she was elected. I think what you saw in 2018, you're beginning to see come together now for 2020. That obviously bodes well for Democrats, but I also think it bodes well for the possibility of cooperating on getting things done. And Joe Biden himself has signaled that you can't simply restore us to where we were before Trump and before the virus. He is talking about the equivalent of a New Deal that we really have to undertake to build ourselves back better than we were before the virus, because the virus has revealed to us forms of inequality and injustice in the country that we are going to have to attend to long after, God willing, this virus is conquered.
Oh, it's interesting you should say that, because the other night, NBA Hall of Famer Charles Barkley was on with Anderson Cooper, and he underscored the need for universal health care that's come out of this pandemic. Let me combine a couple of questions. First, obviously, the pandemic has just been such a major part of our lives and the conversation. And, so the question is, how has that changed the political landscape? And at the same time, in one of your chapters, you say that the biggest lie, I think it's the lead of your chapter, for a politician is to say, I will bring America together. Well, given recent events, can Joe Biden truthfully promise to bring America together?
Well, I think the pandemic it can be looked at in a couple of different ways. On the one hand, Trump himself has obviously not used this as an occasion to bring the country together. He has continued to divide the country. He has continued to attack governors of blue states. He's attacked blue states themselves at times. Recently, a few weeks ago, there he was threatening the state of Michigan because the Secretary of State sent out absentee ballot applications to vote. And he threatened to cut off aid, which I think is the act more of a despot than a small d Democratic leader. He's done all sorts of things to divide us. We appear to be divided culturally when mask wearing becomes somehow a symbol of your politics. If you are a true Trump supporter or a true conservative in this view, I think that's unfair to conservative, which is actually a noble term in certain ways. I'm not a conservative, but I respect the tradition. But you can't wear a mask if you're a conservative. That's kind of crazy, but we got to that point. And obviously you had the demonstrators saying open up the country, as if the desire of jurisdictions to protect people from the virus was in some way subversive in some long-term way to people's freedom. So you saw our divisions right there before us, and the president was doing all he could to exploit them. On the other hand, it struck me that when people sat down and quietly pondered, what should we do here, there was less division than met the eye. There was a Quinnipiac poll in sort of toward the end of May, which gave people a choice. Should we open up quickly, even if that risks spreading the virus, or should we open up more slowly, even if that has economic cost? On the one hand, you saw a partisan split. Republicans were more likely to say open quickly than Democrats. But what really struck me is that only 44% of Republicans said open quickly. A majority of Republicans, contrary to this sense that this is all about division, a majority of Republicans said, no, let's open slowly so that we don't spread the virus. And I think there were a lot of ways in which quietly an awful lot of conservatives and an awful lot of Republicans said this whole narrative that only opening quickly, only taking our chances with people's lives is the way to go. I think it suggests there's more unity in the country in fighting this than our standard accounts would suggest. And I think you're seeing this in one very important way in the contest between Joe Biden and Donald Trump. One of Donald Trump's most important groups in the electorate were white people over the age of 65. And many of them obviously responded to some of Trump's appeal around cultural issues, sometimes racial issues related to race. Some of Trump's biggest losses have been in the polls, have been among voters over 65. Why is that? Because they are vulnerable to the virus, and they heard these messages, let's open the economy, even if there's a cost, meaning even if there's a cost in lives. And they realized it was their lives that were being talked about for the most part, given the people to whom the virus is most dangerous. And that's given them some real second thoughts about President Trump. So what I see coming out of this is, yes, we're going to still be divided as a country. These partisan divisions go deep. Even the virus itself seems to have hit harder in crowded metropolitan areas that are more democratic than in rural areas. Nonetheless, I think there are signs that with effective leadership and with real efforts to bring us together, we do not have to be as divided in 2021 as we have been up to this point.
EJ, you have a chapter. It's entitled "Out of Many What?" ? And you resurrect these wonderful phrases. One first from the Declaration of Independence: "We the people _we," and also the common good, which is a phrase that you don't hear very much anymore. It used to be common, commonly used. So my question is, what's the answer to your question? Out of many what?
Well, when I have an opportunity to give talks before audiences, one of my favorite things to do is to look at the audience and ask them, what is the first word of our Constitution? And of course, some people in the audience immediately say we, and I love to ask the whole audience to say the word we, because we don't say we enough as a country anymore. And I think that when you look at our history as a country, it has been a history of struggle to understand that word we in a more and more inclusive way, so that ultimately we really means all of us. When the Constitution was written, African Americans in the South who were enslaved were not part of that we. Women did not have the right to vote. Obviously, attitudes toward LGBTQ people were very different. The beginning of the Republic, people without property in many states couldn't vote. So our whole history has been a struggle to say we means every single one of us who are American. And there was an implicit promise of that in the Declaration of Independence, and the famous words, all men, and we would now understand it, all persons, all people are created equal. Martin Luther King famously said that was a promissory note that for many years had come back stamped unpaid, insufficient funds. And we've been trying to pay off that promissory note to all Americans. The chapter you referred to was a chapter that talked about identity politics. Now that whole, I think the term identity politics is vexed because it's often used as a term to criticize those who try to stand up for the rights of groups who had traditionally faced discrimination or exclusion, particularly, obviously, African Americans, but also women, LGBTQ people, and others. I quote Stacey Abrams in that chapter, who noted, you know, we didn't ask for identity politics, she said, of African Americans. It was imposed on us because we were treated differently, and we want to be treated as people with equal rights. What I try to do in that chapter is bring together two ideas that are often seen as being in conflict. On the one hand, I think it is both legitimate and necessary for excluded groups to stand up for their rights, and that our progress through the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Acts and other forms of inclusion, that progress needed struggle. We still need to struggle toward equality, as the inequalities of the virus's reach have shown us. But we have struggled in that direction to achieve greater equality. On the other hand, there are a lot of people who also argue, wait a minute, identity politics gets in the way of other forms of politics, particularly class politics. Is it not the case that working class people in the United States, lower income, lower middle income people, whether they are Latino or African American or white, that they face particular forms of inequality and particular forms of unfairness? And I argue in the book that yes, to say that we want to include African Americans, Latinos, people who are gay or lesbian as equals does not mean that we do not talk about the inequalities that have hurt the coal miner who has lost his job, who may be white, or the factory worker who may be white, who has seen his or her, it is often his, income decline over the last decades. And so I argue that we need to understand that we need both a politics of recognition that says, yes, we are going to recognize excluded groups, but we also need a politics of distribution and redistribution that says we are also going to say that the working class person who has suffered declines in income over the last 20 or 30 years deserves relief as well. The way I close it is that we need an economics of dignity. And if I can plug another book which just came out, my friend Gene Sperling, whom I quote in my book, has a very good book called Economic Dignity. And I think it ought to be possible for us as Americans to feel empathy across lines that seem to divide us. I once said that I wanted to, if I wore a hat, it would say, "Make America Empathetic Again." It should not be hard for people who are white to understand the anger and fear of an African American parent who worries when his or her son, teenage son, goes out on the street at night and might be shot. That sense of being under siege because of race is something I think all people, and particularly all parents of every race, ought to be able to relate to. But I also think it should not be hard for people across every line to empathize with the coal miner or the factory worker who is white, who felt he made a deal with the economy to where if he worked hard over time, he'd make a decent living, be rewarded with a decent retirement, and have his and her children live a better life. That deal was broken, and it ought not to be hard for us to empathize with that person. Just to close, the quotation that opens the book is from Robert Kennedy. And I think Robert Kennedy was a figure in our history who really won trust on both sides of this divide. And I think the challenge to politicians in this era is to go back and examine how Bobby Kennedy really managed to win trust from groups who then were also divided against each other, and brought them together behind a program on behalf of justice and dignity.
EJ, do you see any Robert Kennedys emerging from the current crop of, I guess, Democratic politicians in particular? Is anybody articulating it quite as you had, or as he did?
Well, there are a bunch of people, actually, I cite in the book. I think, by the way, Joe Biden has always been someone who spoke very much to white working class people. He loves to present himself as Uncle Joe from Scranton, but has also stood up for civil rights throughout his career. So I think, and he has spoken of Bobby Kennedy as a hero. One person I lift up, I visited with him during the 2018 campaign, is Senator Sherrod Brown of Ohio, who really based his whole campaign in significant part on the idea of the dignity of work, and talking about working people of all races who are denied dignity in their workplace through the income they receive, through the job security they lack. I think that issue, by the way, of the dignity of work has really come up in the treatment of our workers in the meat production industry, where so many of them have been hit by COVID and didn't have the protections that they needed. I think Sherrod Brown is a figure who speaks in those terms. I am sure people watching this video have their own notions of who is following in Robert Kennedy's footsteps. I think there are a lot of politicians out there who have gone back and studied what Kennedy did. The key thing is that Kennedy gave people on both sides of the racial divide, and people who felt a sense of unfairness and injustice, he gave them all a sense that he respected their dignity and their rights. And I think we need politicians who endeavor to do that now, especially because I think that's the only way we can begin to heal some of these deep divides that we keep talking about as splitting our country apart.
All right, well, moving a little bit from the abstract to the specific and the practical, with the president seeking to undermine the Postal Service and his attack on mail balloting and other efforts at voter suppression, as in Texas, for example, how concerned are you about the integrity, the legitimacy of the November election? You have the presidential senior advisor, Jared Kushner, saying he, quote, cannot confirm that there will be a November election. So what are your thoughts?
I just want to say a word in favor of the post office, which is right there in the Constitution. There aren't, it may be the only federal agency mentioned directly in the Constitution. And it's there for a reason, because our founders understood that back in the day, when there wasn't an internet that sometimes goes down on you. The main way of carrying out the political debate in the country was through newspapers that circulated around the country through the post office. And so the post office has always been central to our democracy. It's a really extraordinary American achievement, and I hope that we do not let this great gift to our country disappear, because the post office is a truly remarkable thing. In terms of the election, there are ways in which I am not worried about this controversy and ways in which I am. There are some reassuring aspects to this. In all of the swing states, they at least provide for no excuse absentee balloting, so that in the states that will almost certainly decide the election in the Electoral College, by the way, I think it's a long past time we get rid of the Electoral College, but we don't have to go there right now.
My next question. No.
Oh, I'm sorry?
That's on my list, but you go ahead.
In the states that are likely to be decisive, they already have relatively easy access to absentee ballots. The question is, will we make it even easier by having mail ballots sent to everyone, as they do in a number of states, such as Colorado, which increases voter turnout? In Maryland, where I live, the governor, a Republican governor, by the way, moved the whole primary to mail balloting, and I actually got a ballot in the mail that I was able to drop into a post office box to cast my ballot. I think where I start worrying is in two ways. One is, no matter how you slice it, there will be more mail voting in this election than at any time in history. We have already been moving as a country away from voting on election day. Something like 40% of the ballots, I think, in the midterms were already being cast in some other way than at a polling place on election day. A lot of states have early voting as well as easy mail voting. We're going to have an avalanche of mail ballots this year as people decide they don't want to risk going to the polls if the virus is still around. That's where funding by Congress becomes very important. My hope there is there are Republican secretaries of state around the country who want those resources, who see their job as trying as best they can to enable people to vote. So I think over time, those resources might be there. But here's my biggest worry is that if we do have an expected avalanche of mail voting, it means that the election result might not be known on election night. Most states are likely to have rules that say any ballot with a postmark that indicates that it was cast on election day should be counted. That means there will be millions of ballots that probably will not be counted on election night. Look how long it takes us to get all the vote in from California. The full results of California aren't usually known for weeks. Now, California won't be close, but Arizona, for example, is a state with a lot of mail balloting. And in the last Senate race there, the mail ballots tipped the result from where it was on election night to where it ended up. Imagine what President Trump is going to do with that. And I really worry that he will, if the election is close and the mail ballots come in later and decided against him, he is going to make a lot of false claims that there is something illegitimate about a perfectly legitimate result. I also worry about getting in the way of mail ballots, not necessarily because they won't eventually go out and get cast, but because anything that reduces access to mail ballots means that lines on election day can become very long if people don't get mail ballots. Those lines, given the way polling places have tended to be distributed in the United States, it is a form of injustice in terms of access. You often have the longest lines in inner city districts. You could intimidate some voters away who show up and don't feel that they can't just stay in line for hours and hours, or their work doesn't permit it. And I worry that there may be a lot of people out there aiming to suppress the votes of African Americans or other minorities, challenging voters at the polls, making the lines even longer. Those are the kinds of things I am very worried about on election day. And I think all these things, again, you talk about a divided country, are going to sow all sorts of resentment and anger in our electorate. In a way, you have to hope for a landslide, which would obviate, and obviously people know which way I'm rooting in the election, but a landslide might obviate some of these problems.
Well, let's talk about a landslide. Let's assume the Democrats win the White House and they win majorities in both houses of Congress, but there is also the Trump Supreme Court, which has just refused to release redacted portions of the Mueller report to the House of Representatives. So if the highest court in the land refuses to uphold the constitutional principle of checks and balances, what then? What's the remedy? Where's the hope?
I am very, very worried about the Supreme Court. And I think the court, even before, say, the denial of a hearing, let alone a vote, to Merrick Garland when President Obama named him to the court, even before then, conservatives on the court were turning in decisions that I think were fundamentally anti-democratic, small d democratic, although they, in partisan terms, they often had the large D effect, anti-democratic in that sense. Two decisions that really went to the heart of democracy were, on the one side, the Citizens United decision, which radically undercut long-standing practices of trying to limit the power of big money in politics. Citizens United undercut precedents that went back 30 years and arguably even much longer than that. And on the other hand, the decision gutting the enforcement of the Voting Rights Act. So you had a Supreme Court intervening in our politics, on the one side, privileging the privileged, and on the other side, taking rights away from those who would face discrimination and exclusion. And those are just two examples of court decisions by a 5-4 conservative majority that I think are very troublesome. And I agree that the portents of how the court might deal with Congress's rights vis-a-vis Trump are very, very disturbing. I have come around to the view, which I didn't always hold, that ideas like the ones Pete Buttigieg put forward in the campaign, that maybe we do want to expand the court, that there has been such an abuse of power, both by the conservative majority on the court and by Republicans in Congress to prevent, as I said, even a hearing for Merrick Garland, that you could have a conservative court undercutting the Democratic will for a long time. And yes, there's a role for the court. We believe that a court's job is to uphold minority rights. The majority does not have the right to vote away rights of others. And that's where historically what was called the New Deal settlement, I think, worked very well for us, that the courts would intervene on the side of excluded minorities, but would let Congress have a lot of room to legislate on economic and social matters, on labor rights, on environmental matters. I am very worried about a Supreme Court pushing us all the way back to pre-New Deal jurisprudence. And so I think we're going to have a heck of a fight about the court going ahead. And I think progressives are going to have to think more beyond where they've thought up to now, which is why I was grateful that Buttigieg did put some ideas in play, that maybe the time has come to push back on this partisanship and on conservative judicial activism.
So a couple of things that you touched on very briefly. Talk about the Electoral College and the potential for the third time this century for a candidate with fewer votes to, quote, win the presidential election. Also, the Senate majority's stranglehold on legislation when Wyoming, population 578,000, has the same 2 votes as California, population 37 million. The framers did not envision such perversion of the democratic process, or did they?
No, what with the small state compromise, when we put the union together, small states like Delaware were worried that big states like New York or then Virginia would dominate the republic. So the Senate was created to give small states relatively more power than their population would get them if seats in both houses were distributed by population. When the republic was created, the ratio between the smallest in population between the smallest state and the largest state was 13-1. Now that ratio is somewhere around 70-1. If you look ahead, by 2040, the projections are that 70% of us, 70% of Americans will live in 15 states. That means 70% of Americans will have 30% of the votes in the Senate. There is something very troubling about this for a democratic country. I don't think any other Republican democracy in the world has this sort of inequality in a major branch of its government, this sort of, I won't say inequality, this sort of misrepresentation in any of its branches of government. Unfortunately, the Constitution makes it almost impossible to fix the Senate. The only way you could improve representation is either to let in some new states or to split up some existing states, and Congress would have to authorize that. This has a reverberating effect on the Electoral College. It is no accident that we have had so many elections now. Basically the Bush election in 2000, followed by the Trump election, and a very strong likelihood that if Trump were to win the Electoral College, he will almost certainly lose the popular vote on the current numbers by even more than he lost it to Hillary Clinton. There's a reason this is happening, which is the population of the country is shifting more and more to metropolitan areas, and yet sparsely populated rural areas are getting even more of a premium in terms of representation. This is very worrisome for our democracy, and I think over the long run creates the possibility of a real legitimacy crisis. Imagine, I ran the numbers, imagine a scenario where Donald Trump won the Electoral College by 2 electoral votes. That is what would happen if Joe Biden carried Pennsylvania and Michigan, but Trump held on to every other electoral vote he won against Hillary Clinton. Imagine he wins that 2-vote Electoral College majority with a loss of the popular vote of 5 or 6 million, which is very easy to imagine because Biden could win enormous margins in places like California and New York and Massachusetts, all through New England and a lot of other parts of the country. You think we're polarized now if we have a result like that on election night? So at the very least, I would like to figure out how we can have some rectification of representation in the Senate, but I surely think the time has come to get rid of the Electoral College. I express sympathy for this electoral compact that the state of Maryland and about states are representing about, as I remember the number, around 170 electors, maybe a little more. States agree that if states representing a majority of the electors agrees, they will cast their ballots for the winner of the popular vote. That's a way to get around the idea of amending the Constitution. I'm sure it would be litigated, but we have to move toward electing president by the popular vote. And by the way, I would twin that with an instant runoff proposal. Maine just shifted its system to an instant runoff where you not only vote for your choice, but you rank order your choices. And what this would do is it would mean that if somebody voted third party, but had a strong preference between the two major party candidates, they could rank their third party first, and then one of the other major candidates say second. So you wouldn't have the splits that you had that, for example, helped elect George W. Bush in 2000, when it's pretty clear from looking at the numbers that if people had cast their second choice votes, Al Gore would have won a majority. And by the way, this doesn't just help Democrats. There are conservative states where libertarian votes would probably shift to the Republican. But those are reforms I would like to see. The instant runoff is something states can do right now, and I would like more states to do it.
Well, EJ, this has been a sobering discussion. In Code Red, in spite of everything we've talked about, you strike a cautious note of optimism, based in no small part on the 2018 midterm election results. Now, the Bulletin for the Atomic Scientists, as you may know, have what they call the countdown clock to total nuclear disaster. So, to use that analogy, are we further or closer to the ultimate disaster that you fear going forward?
I truly think that if President Trump is reelected, it poses some fundamental dangers to our republic. I think as his administration has gone on, we have seen more and more willingness to abuse power outright. The most recent example we can see is in the firing of one inspector general after another in various departments designed to prevent accountability. Another is in the complete refusal to acknowledge what presidents of both parties in the past have accommodated, which is Congress's right to hold the executive branch accountable and to investigate potential wrongdoing. No president of either party, presidents always resist and negotiate, but no president has resisted that power to the degree that President Trump has, I'm sorry. And then I think you see our position in the world itself. I think that we are weaker in the world and have less influence in the world because of the way President Trump has carried out his presidency. I think our position would get even worse if he were reelected. But I would set the countdown clock back in a more positive way for a couple of reasons. Number one, I think there are a lot of people in the country, and it's clear from the polls, who have looked at President Trump's performance during this crisis and have said, people who may have said, well, maybe we can reelect him because the economy is pretty good and no terrible thing has happened yet. And I think a lot of people are looking at his performance in this crisis and saying, really, this is why it is dangerous to have someone in power who doesn't really take governing seriously, who doesn't see his job as trying to bring the country together in the face of a huge problem that affects us all, and who doesn't respect the importance of the workings of government. And that's where I move to the hopeful side. I think that this crisis has shown to folks who said, why is government there? What good does government do me? Senator Bill Cohen, a Republican who later worked for President Clinton, is the author of one of my favorite lines about politics. He said, government is the enemy until you need a friend. And we know, especially at times of crisis, that we need a government that can function. We need a CDC that can function. We need an FDA that can function. We need the federal government intervening to help states buy equipment that they need, rather than creating what we had under President Trump, which is competition among states for necessary equipment to deal with a crisis. No other president has done that before. So I think there is a real awareness in the country that government matters and that competent government matters. And I think there's a real awareness in the country that over the last 30 years or so, we have let inequalities get out of hand in a way that flies in the face of the common good, that flies in the face of what we need to hold our country together, to guarantee opportunities to all Americans, and to treat every American with equal dignity. I think Americans are now ready to move toward a politics of dignity, a politics of the common good, a politics of both economic and political justice. I hope we get that in 2020. I wrote this book to make a case for that. And I am really grateful to Eugene for spending this time with me, for the audience for listening to us. My apology for that little interruption. And thanks so much to the Gaithersburg Book Festival and to the great folks at Politics and Prose. Patronize your local independent bookstore. Bless you all. Thanks. And again, thanks so much, Gene.
Well, EJ, thank you. And if I can say for we the people, on behalf of we the people, thank you.
Bless you. Thanks.
Code Red, and thank you for your insights.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
EJ and Gene, this was just a fantastic interview. I can't thank you enough for spending your time with us here tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.
Enjoyed it.
I'd like to thank all of you for being with us for this week's Saturday night premiere. I'm certain that you'd enjoy picking up your own copy of Code Red, How Progressives and Moderates Can Unite and Save Our Country, which you can do now by visiting our partner, independent bookstore, Politics and Prose. Just click on the link that we have provided in the description box below to order your copy. Folks, we've got just 2 more featured events before the 2020 virtual Gaithersburg Book Festival comes to a close. It's gone so quick, and they're both happening tomorrow. The kids can tune in at 11 a.m. to join author Juana Medina as she shares her latest book, Juana and Lucas, Big Problemas. And parents, our VGBF closing program tomorrow afternoon is designed for you. Join us at 3 p.m. for an important conversation featuring the book, How to Raise a Reader, which has been hailed as an indispensable guide to welcoming children to a lifelong love of reading. Author Maria Russo, who is the children's book editor of the New York Times Book Review, will be in conversation with Library of Congress consultant Kathy Weinberg. Both presentations will be accessible right here on the GBF YouTube channel. Okay, my friends, that wraps it up for tonight. I've been your VGBF host, Phil Kaminsky. Have a great evening, and as always, keep reading.